Russia didn't see this coming. In 7 days, Ukraine launched what may be the most concentrated cross-domain offensive since the fall of Kherson, striking over 140 confirmed Russian military targets across 4 oblasts, destroying an estimated 23% of Russia's forward ammunition staging capacity in the southern sector, and doing it not with some massive Western-supplied wonder weapon, but with a combination of systems so tightly integrated that Russian air defense commanders reportedly had less than 9 seconds of warning before the first wave hit. 7 days, 23%, and Moscow is still trying to figure out exactly how it happened. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications, because what we cover on this channel is not the headline version of this war. It is the version that explains what the headlines actually mean and why they matter far beyond the battlefield. If you are the kind of person who wants to understand the strategic logic driving the biggest military conflict in Europe since 1945, you are in the right place. Here is what I am going to show you today. Over the past 7 days, Ukraine executed a coordinated offensive sequence that combined long-range precision strike, electronic warfare suppression, drone saturation, and ground force exploitation in a way that we have not seen from Kyiv at this scale before. I am going to walk you through the specific weapon systems that made this possible, including at least 2 that have never been confirmed in operational use until now. We are going to cover the geographic logic behind why Ukraine hit where it hit, what the destruction of these specific targets means for Russia's ability to sustain offensive operations this summer, and why several NATO intelligence officials I have seen quoted this week are privately using a word that almost nobody expected to hear at this stage of the war: irreversible. By the end of this video, you will understand not just what happened in these 7 days, but why this week may represent the moment the structural math of this war fundamentally changed. To understand why this 7-day blitz matters, you have to understand what the battlefield looked like before it started. Since late 2025, Russia has been pursuing what Western defense analysts have called a grinding attritional strategy along the Eastern Front, primarily in the Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia oblasts. The core logic of that strategy is simple and, frankly, has been effective. Russia accepts enormous casualties in exchange for slow but steady territorial gains, relying on its significant advantages in manpower, artillery ammunition supply, and sheer willingness to absorb losses that would be politically intolerable in any democratic society. Through the winter of 2025 into early 2026, that strategy produced measurable results. Russian forces advanced in small increments around Pokrovsk, applied sustained pressure near Orikhiv, and maintained a constant bombardment tempo that forced Ukraine into reactive defensive postures across hundreds of kilometers of front line. The key to this strategy is logistics. Every artillery shell that hits a Ukrainian trench, every glide bomb that strikes a Ukrainian position, every wave of infantry that surges forward has to be supplied from somewhere. And that somewhere is a network of ammunition depots, fuel storage facilities, rail transfer points, and forward staging areas that stretch from deep inside Russia through occupied Ukrainian territory to positions just behind the front lines. This logistical network is Russia's center of gravity. It is the engine that keeps the grinding machine running, and Ukraine just put a wrench through it. Now let me give you the actor profiles you need. On the Russian side, the forces operating in the southern and eastern sectors fall primarily under the command structure of Russia's Southern Military District, reinforced by elements redeployed from other theaters and supplemented by mobilized personnel with varying levels of training. Russian air defense in the occupied territories relies on a layered system built around the S-300 and S-400 families, supplemented by shorter-range Buk M2 and Tor M2 systems, and increasingly by electronic warfare complexes designed to counter the drone threat that has defined this war. On paper, this is a formidable defensive architecture. In practice, as we are about to see, it has critical vulnerabilities that Ukraine has learned to exploit with extraordinary precision. On the Ukrainian side, the forces that executed this week's operations represent what amounts to a new model of combined arms warfare, one that does not look like anything in the NATO playbook or the Soviet doctrinal manuals that Russian commanders trained on. Ukraine has spent the past 18 months integrating Western-supplied precision munitions, indigenously developed long-range strike drones, electronic warfare capabilities that have improved dramatically since 2024, and a battlefield intelligence network built on a combination of Western satellite feeds, signals intelligence, and a distributed sensor network of small commercial drones that provides near real-time targeting data. The result is a force that can see deep, strike precisely, and adapt faster than its opponent's decision cycle. One more piece of baseline context before we get into the operations themselves. The geographic terrain in the southern sector, particularly in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast and the areas connecting to the Crimean logistics corridor, features relatively flat steppe with limited natural concealment for large military installations. Russia has compensated for this by dispersing ammunition and fuel stores across dozens of smaller sites, rather than concentrating them in a few large depots. This dispersal strategy makes individual targets smaller, but it also means Russia needs a functioning transportation network, primarily rail, to move supplies between these distributed nodes and forward positions. Hit enough nodes or hit the connections between them, and the entire network begins to degrade. That is exactly what happened. Let me take you through this day by day because the sequencing is what makes this offensive so remarkable. Day 1 and Day 2 focused almost entirely on electronic warfare suppression and intelligence preparation. According to reporting from the Ukrainian General Staff and corroborated by several open-source intelligence analysts tracking radar emissions, Ukraine initiated a coordinated electronic warfare campaign targeting Russian air defense radars across a roughly 200-kilometer front in the southern Zaporizhzhia and western Donetsk sectors. This was not simple jamming. Multiple sources, including a detailed assessment published by the Royal United Services Institute, indicate that Ukraine employed a combination of expendable decoy drones designed to trigger radar emissions, signals intelligence platforms to precisely geolocate those emitters once they activated, and electronic attack systems that degraded specific frequencies used by Russian command and control networks, linking air defense batteries to their command posts. The tactical significance is this. For a window estimated at several hours across the first 2 days, Russian integrated air defense in the targeted sectors was not destroyed, but it was degraded enough to create exploitable gaps. Radar coverage became intermittent. Communication between battery-level units and sector command posts experienced disruption. And critically, the reaction time between detection of an incoming threat and authorization to engage increased from the normal 4 to 6 second window to something significantly longer. The strategic implication goes further. This was Ukraine demonstrating an electronic warfare suppression capability that most Western analysts did not believe Kyiv possessed at this scale. Suppression of enemy air defenses, known in NATO terminology as SEAD, is one of the most complex and demanding missions in modern warfare. The United States Air Force has spent decades and hundreds of billions of dollars perfecting it. Ukraine just executed a version of it with a fraction of the resources, adapted to the specific characteristics of the systems Russia deploys. That is not a minor development. That is a doctrinal innovation that every military in the world is going to study. Days 3 through 5 are where the kinetic destruction began, and the numbers are staggering. With Russian air defenses degraded, Ukraine launched a coordinated precision strike campaign targeting ammunition depots, fuel storage sites, and rail infrastructure across the southern and eastern sectors. The weapons employed tell a story of their own. According to Ukrainian military sources and satellite imagery analyzed by firms including Planet Labs and Black Sky, the strikes involved a mix of at least 4 distinct systems. ATACMS ballistic missiles, the MGM-140 variant with a range of approximately 300 kilometers, struck the highest value hardened targets, including at least 2 major ammunition storage facilities near Tokmak and one near the rail junction at Polohai. Storm Shadow cruise missiles, the Anglo-French Scalp EG variant with a range exceeding 250 kilometers, hit targets that required the kind of low-altitude terrain-following approach profile that makes interception significantly more difficult. These were used against logistics nodes that satellite imagery showed had received significant reinforcement with earthen berms and overhead concealment, suggesting Russia knew they were high-priority targets and had tried to protect them. But here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Alongside these Western-supplied systems, Ukraine employed what multiple sources are now confirming as an operationally deployed version of its indigenously developed Polyanitsia cruise missile, a jet-powered ground-launched weapon with an estimated range of over 700 kilometers. If confirmed, and the evidence is becoming difficult to dismiss, this represents a transformational moment for Ukraine's strike capability. A domestically produced cruise missile means Ukraine is no longer entirely dependent on Western supply decisions to hit targets deep behind Russian lines. It means production can be scaled on Ukrainian terms. And it means Russia now faces a threat axis it cannot address through diplomatic pressure on Washington or London. The fourth system, and in some ways the most tactically significant was the massive use of one-way attack drones. The Ukrainian-produced models in the Lutyi and Beaver family launched in swarms of dozens simultaneously against dispersed targets that were too numerous or too small to justify expenditure of expensive cruise missiles. These drones, costing a fraction of what a Storm Shadow costs, were used to hit fuel trucks, field ammunition points, repair facilities, and communication nodes. The saturation approach meant that even functioning Russian air defense systems faced an impossible allocation problem. You cannot shoot down 40 incoming drones when you have 12 interceptor missiles available. The results across these 3 days, as confirmed by a combination of Ukrainian claims, geolocated satellite imagery, and notably cautious assessments from the Institute for the Study of War, are significant. At least 14 ammunition storage sites were struck, with secondary explosions at 9 of them indicating successful detonation of stored munitions. 3 major rail transfer points sustained damage sufficient to halt rail traffic, confirmed by commercial satellite imagery showing destroyed rail cars and cratered switching yards. Fuel storage facilities at a minimum of 5 locations were hit, with fires visible on thermal imaging for over 48 hours in some cases. The Ukrainian General Staff's estimate that 23% of Russia's forward ammunition staging capacity in the southern sector was destroyed in this window is dramatic, but based on the available evidence, it appears to be in the plausible range. Think about what that means for a moment. 23% of forward ammunition capacity does not mean Russia runs out of shells tomorrow. It means the rate at which ammunition can be moved from rear area production and storage to guns on the front line has been significantly reduced. For an army whose entire operational concept depends on sustained high-volume fire, that is not an inconvenience. That is a structural problem. Days 6 and 7 shifted from deep strike to exploitation, and this is where the operational design becomes clear in retrospect. With Russian logistics disrupted and command and control networks still recovering from the electronic warfare campaign, Ukrainian ground forces launched probing attacks along at least 3 axes in the Zaporizhzhia sector. These were not major breakthroughs. Open-source tracking indicates advances measured in single-digit kilometers in some areas. But that is not the point. The point is that Ukrainian forces were able to advance against positions that had been receiving reduced resupply for 72 hours. Russian units that would normally respond to a probing attack with massive artillery fire found their ammunition supplies constrained. Counter-battery fire, which depends on a constant flow of shells to guns, was reportedly reduced by as much as 40% in some sectors, according to intercepts cited by Ukrainian military intelligence. This is combined arms warfare as it should be fought. Not a single devastating blow, but a sequence of mutually reinforcing operations where each phase creates the conditions for the next. Degrade air defense. Then strike logistics. Then exploit the disruption with ground forces. The textbooks call this operational art. Ukraine just demonstrated it against a numerically superior opponent that has been on the offensive for months. Now let me connect this to the second-order effects because they extend well beyond the immediate battlefield. Russia's logistical network in occupied Ukraine is not infinitely resilient. Every destroyed ammunition depot has to be replaced by drawing from reserves further back, which means longer supply lines, more vulnerable convoys, and greater demand on a rail network that is already operating under strain. The destruction of rail infrastructure is particularly significant because Russia's military logistics system is fundamentally rail-dependent in a way that Western militaries, with their emphasis on truck-based distribution, are not. A single damaged rail junction can cascade into delays across an entire supply network. Multiply that by 3 confirmed junction strikes, and you begin to understand why Russian military bloggers, who tend to be more honest than official statements, have been describing this week in terms that range from deeply concerned to openly alarmed. There is an economic dimension here as well. Every ATACMS missile and Storm Shadow that Ukraine fires has to be replaced from Western stocks or production lines. But every Russian ammunition depot that explodes represents not just the munitions inside it, but the cost of producing those munitions, transporting them thousands of kilometers from factories in the Urals or Siberia, and the time required to reconstitute the supply. The exchange ratio, in economic terms, heavily favors the side doing the precision striking over the side stockpiling ammunition in fixed locations. The alliance implications deserve attention too. Ukraine's demonstration of SAD capability and the apparent operational deployment of the Paleonitsia missile send messages that extend far beyond Moscow. NATO member states that have been debating the pace and scope of military aid are watching this week closely. A Ukraine that can execute this kind of operation is a Ukraine that is converting Western assistance into battlefield results at an efficiency that strengthens the political case for continued support. Conversely, a Russia whose forward logistics can be degraded by 23% in a week is a Russia that looks meaningfully more vulnerable than the monolithic military machine its propaganda portrays. Now, I want to be honest about the limitations and complexities here, because intellectual honesty requires it, and because this audience deserves it. First, the 23% figure for ammunition capacity destruction comes from the Ukrainian General Staff, and while available evidence supports it being in a plausible range, it is not independently verified at the level of certainty I would prefer. Satellite imagery confirms many of the strikes and secondary explosions, but translating destroyed facilities into precise percentage degradation of overall capacity requires assumptions about how much material was stored at each site and how much total capacity Russia maintains. The actual figure could be lower, it could conceivably be higher. What is not in doubt is that the scale of destruction was significant. Second, Russia has demonstrated throughout this war a remarkable capacity to adapt, reconstitute, and absorb punishment. The logistical damage inflicted this week is real, but it would be a mistake to assume Russia cannot repair rail junctions, redistribute ammunition from other sectors, or accelerate delivery from deep reserves. Russian military logistics are not elegant, but they are resilient in ways that have repeatedly surprised Western analysts. The question is not whether Russia can recover, but how long recovery takes and what opportunities that recovery window creates. Third, Ukraine's ability to repeat this kind of operation is not unlimited. ATACMS and Storm Shadow stocks are finite, and resupply depends on political decisions in Washington and European capitals that are never guaranteed. The Palianitsia, if it is indeed operational, helps address this dependency, but indigenous production is still at early scale. There is a real question about whether Ukraine can sustain this tempo or whether this week represents a peak that will be followed by a period of reduced capability. Fourth, we should acknowledge the Russian perspective. Moscow will frame this week differently, emphasizing its own strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure, territorial gains elsewhere on the front, and the continued pressure its forces are applying. War is not a single narrative, and the view from Moscow, while heavily distorted by state media, is not entirely disconnected from reality. Russia remains a formidable military power with nuclear capability, strategic depth, and a political system that does not face electoral accountability for casualties. Here is what this all comes down to, and why this week matters beyond the immediate damage reports. For over a year, the dominant narrative of this war has been one of grinding attrition favoring Russia's size and willingness to absorb losses. That narrative was not wrong. But what Ukraine demonstrated in these 7 days is that attrition is not destiny. The structural advantages Russia enjoys in manpower and raw material can be offset, at least partially and perhaps decisively, by superior operational design, technological integration, and precision targeting of the logistical infrastructure that converts those raw advantages into battlefield effect. Russia's strategy depends on a machine. That machine runs on ammunition, fuel, and functioning supply lines. Ukraine just proved it can damage that machine faster than Russia can repair it, at least in specific sectors and for defined windows of time. If Ukraine can sustain even a fraction of this operational tempo, if Western resupply continues, if indigenous production scales, then the grinding math that has favored Moscow begins to look different, not reversed overnight, but changed in ways that are, to use the word NATO intelligence officials have reportedly been employing, potentially irreversible. The next few weeks will tell us whether this 7-day blitz was a one-time expenditure of accumulated capability or the beginning of a sustained campaign that fundamentally alters the trajectory of this war. Watch the ammunition flow. Watch the rail network. Watch whether Russian artillery fire rates in the southern sector return to pre-blitz levels or remain suppressed. Those indicators will tell you more than any official statement from either side. That is the analysis for today. If this kind of deep, evidence-based coverage is what you are looking for, subscribe to States News and turn on notifications. We are going to be tracking the aftermath of this offensive closely, including the specific Russian response and what it tells us about Moscow's remaining options. I will see you in the next one.